Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.
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 Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast with me, Dr. Janine Anderson. Heads up, this show may contain adult language and may mention specific foods. If you find either of those to be too triggering, I trust you to take care of yourself and do what you need to do. Hello, friends. It's good to be with you again today. I'm writing here from beautiful Denver, Colorado, where we are enjoying a gorgeous spring day after a few days of unpredictable, cold, crappy weather. All right, a couple of things to start. First, apparently we've been having some technical difficulties with the email for the podcast. Thank you for letting me know. My co-producer and I test those sort of things out before they go live, but sometimes things go wrong anyway. So the email is back up and should be working. The email for the podcast is podcast@eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com. Again, I'd love to hear from you. Write me with your questions, requests for episodes, or topics you'd like for me to cover, those sorts of things. I'm always happy to hear from you. I don't know if you guys can hear my dog in the background whining. He gets kind of jealous when I record the podcast because I'm talking to somebody other than him. All right. On a similar note to writing in about the podcast, when I initially thought about starting the podcast, one of the things I hoped it could do would be to connect people who are in recovery with each other and give us a sense of community. That said, I think it would be really cool to have all of you write to each other, and I can moderate that discussion for you. So if you are newer to recovery or actively working very hard on recovery right now, and you'd like to ask someone who has more recovery under their belt a question, email the podcast. I often hear my clients asking questions like, how long does it really take? What happened that made you want to actually recover? Or what's recovery like? So those questions are always welcome. So shoot us an email. Or if you're someone who identifies as being in recovery or as recovered, or just feels like you're on solid ground, however you want to say it, I want to hear your stories too. I want to hear about what made you commit to recovery, how you did it, who helped you along the way, what it was like, what you learned, and most of all, I want to hear your reasons to recover. If you write me, let me know if you want for me to include your name if I read part of your letter on the podcast, or let me know if you want to remain anonymous, or just go ahead and use a pseudonym. Don't come up with anything obscene because although I'll probably laugh at that, I won't read it on the podcast. So if you go to my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Dr. Anderson Author, you'll see I've started a thread using the hashtag Reasons to Recover, and it's to spelled out T-O, so we can chat about this on social media too. I think it's important to keep the big picture in mind when you're working really hard to recover from an eating disorder or to let go of disordered eating behaviors, or just to get to a place where you have a healthy, peaceful relationship with food and your body. Which is a good segue for going into our topic today. Today we're talking about the spectrum that I think about of having a healthy relationship with food all the way through on the other end of the spectrum, eating disorders. So I often get questions from people on how they could tell if they have an eating disorder, which, by the way, if you're truly concerned about that, please check out episode 4 of the podcast. I think people know some patterns that they have with food, or maybe thoughts they have about food, or their bodies that on some level they recognize aren't helpful to them, or they feel uncomfortable with them. So here's how I think about people's relationship with food. I picture this as existing along a spectrum. So think about it. Visualize one of those Likert scales. Those are those horizontal lines that have the little tick marks in between. So can you see it in your mind? All right. On one end, let's just say the far left side for this example is a healthy relationship with food. To me, having a healthy relationship with food includes several things. First, have a healthy relationship with food. You think about nourishing yourself. You think about what nutrients your body needs to operate, not from a rule-based perspective, but because you know your body needs fuel to do all of the wonderful things it does for you every single day. Breathing, heart beating, moving you around, allowing your brain to do all the things that it does. In addition to nourishing yourself, in a healthy relationship with food, you also honor satisfaction, meaning that you eat things because you enjoy them too, that you get pleasure from them, because you want to participate in a meal with friends or family, or partake in a particular cultural tradition. And when you eat for those reasons, satisfaction, to be social, to experience culture, you don't freak out. In a healthy relationship with food, you aren't panicked with anxiety. You don't feel overwhelmed with guilt. And you don't feel like you need to, quote, make up for what you ate by exercising. In healthy eating, you feel a peaceful balance between nourishing yourself and honoring satisfaction through making attuned choices. Attuned choices are in line with what your body is asking for. So don't worry, we're going to talk more about attuned eating, so much more about what attuned eating is and how you can cultivate that skill for yourself in the future or further develop, what you already have with that skill. In healthy relationships with food, we eat when we're hungry and we stop when we're full. Another key feature of healthy relationships with food that I want to talk about is that in a healthy relationship with food, your food and exercise choices are not dictated by your body image. So you don't wake up in the morning, look in the mirror, start to feel bad about yourself, and then decide to eat less for breakfast or exercise for longer. In a healthy relationship with food, nourishing your body with food, body image have more separation. And finally, I want to speak to the emotional experience of having a healthy relationship with food. When you have a healthy relationship with food, you have a feeling of kindness toward your body. You act out of love toward it. You feel peaceful about the food choices you make because you know they honor your body and bring you satisfaction. You don't worry about good foods and bad foods because you don't have judgment toward foods. You're not ruled by guilt and shame and riddled with regret about the foods you choose to eat. So that's a very brief overview of how I think about our healthy relationships with food. And I should add that when you have a really healthy relationship with food, taking up a lot of your mental space or mental energy. Food is just part of your daily routine. You have to feed yourself, you have to eat meals, you have to eat snacks. And as we move along the continuum, you'll see that the obsessive thoughts about food only continue to increase. And with a healthy relationship with food, that's just not the case Food is a lot less charged. It's not as emotional. It's a way to get nourishment and a way to experience some satisfaction or pleasure. It's not an overarching thing that takes over all of your thoughts. So that's my snapshot of having a healthy relationship with food. Now, let's go back to our visual of that spectrum. Remember, a healthy relationship with food was on the far left. So let's move one notch over to the right. Kind of move a little further along this spectrum. The next step along the spectrum is the diet mentality. When you have a diet mentality, you have more judgment around food. You have more food rules. You tend to think of foods in terms of good foods and bad foods. This is like we talked about on episode 5 with all or none thinking and food rules. When you're in the diet mentality, some foods are allowed and others are not. Sometimes this can even be entire food groups are not allowed. Sometimes the diet mentality is wrapped up in the eyes of health, causing us to think some foods are more worthy or acceptable than others. And this sort of thinking leads us not only to policing ourselves, but also to judging other people's food choices. And that's one of the most frustrating, upsetting things to me. I get somebody on to talk about this who's kind of an expert in this area of how our food rules will translate over into our opinions of what other people are doing with their food, and how it's really easy to feign concern for somebody else's health when really we're just uncomfortable with choices or maybe their body shape or size. So getting back to the diet mentality. Having a diet mentality keeps people trapped in a mindset of counting calories, tracking what foods they eat, weighing themselves, and worst of all, forever hopeful that there will be a quick, easy answer to weight. That if we can just eat the right amount of the right foods and exercise just enough, everything will be all right. It keeps people looking for a simple solution and places values on the external rules of whatever the diet du jour is and pulls people away from listening to their body. So that's one really important thing to keep in mind about dieting, is that dieting is really has a lot of trends in it, and those come and we're always just looking for the next thing. Oh, well, if we just stop eating this, or if we just start eating this, if we eat this in this balance, like everything's going to be fine. I'm finally going to get to the weight that I want. And that's an interesting question to me too. Like, what happens when you get to the weight that you want? Like, fine, you get to feel good about yourself. You don't have to feel emotions anymore. I gave that a real go, and that never worked out for me. In the dieting mentality, you're following rules about what to eat instead of listening to your body's wise physiological hunger and fullness cues. So unlike having a healthy relationship with food where you eat when you're hungry and you stop when you're full, dieting tells you, let go of that. Watch the clock. It may be too early to eat lunch. You're not allowed to eat something because you already had enough of this one food or food group, and that's all you can have for the day. Even if in your body, in your belly, it's saying, I need more. I'm not full. I'm not completely satisfied with this yet. So here's the thing. We know from recent diets do not work. Diets have been demonstrated to be ineffective in long-term weight loss, and they put you at increased risk for health problems, and they increase your risk of weight gain over the long term. Mention that over 95% of all eating disorders start with a diet. Like, that's one of the main common factors, which we just don't see statistics like that in anything else. Like, if you think about any other issue, health issue that we wanted, if we could say 95% of people, we would be like, oh my goodness, stop this thing. But for eating disorders, that thing is dieting, and we are in a diet-obsessed culture. So it's really difficult to undo. I also want to point out that eating disorders have the highest mortality rates of all mental illnesses, and that anorexia does have the highest mortality rate of all mental illnesses. So what that means is, out of the people who have anorexia, a greater percentage of them die because of the disease than any other disease out there. So the diet mentality presents your decisions with food as transactional. So what I mean by that is, you eat this many calories, so you need to burn this many calories to stay okay, to still be good, to feel comfortable to feel good about yourself. And the diet mentality says it's too early to eat dinner, even if you can feel in your stomach that you need to. The diet mentality says you've already eaten your calories for lunch, limiting you from eating more, even though you don't feel fullness from what you ate. In the diet mentality, the focus is placed on external cues, so things that exist outside of your body's wisdom, like carbs are bad, kale is good. And it pulls you away from listening to how much or carbohydrates your body wants in that moment. The diet mentality keeps you constantly measuring to figure out whether you measure up. The diet mentality will always keep you searching for an easy way out. And there is no easy way out of taking care of yourself. It takes ongoing maintenance and work and love. So dieting and that dieting mentality, I think, can be so attractive and appealing to people because it promises you this quick for your self-esteem, for how you want to feel about your body, maybe what to do with your time. And so you can finally have that weight, that body, that shape that you've always wanted if you just do these little things. But it never turns out that way. And having a healthy relationship with food is continued, ongoing effort. We have to keep feeding ourselves. That happens multiple times a day. It's part of our existence. And the dieting mentality gets in the way of accepting that and tending to that with love. So we've got 2 notches on our bar. So the first one is healthy relationship with food. Next one up is the diet mentality. And if we go one beyond that to our next category, past dieting is disordered eating. Disordered eating is as people will say, a full-blown eating disorder, but there are some of the same things happening. Disordered eating is a step beyond dieting. With disordered eating, people start to take more extreme measures like skipping whole meals, severely restricting their caloric intake, or abusing exercise by exercising away most of the calories for the day. With disordered eating, we also start to see more problematic emotional eating or overeating, meaning that the overeating or emotional eating are occurring frequently enough to cause problems for that person, but not frequently enough for a formal eating disorder diagnosis. Disordered eating is a notch below diagnosable eating disorders, and disordered eating is flirting with danger. Disordered eating also includes things like ritualistic behavior around food. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I'm aware that some listeners, but I do want to give you an idea. So again, if this is not going to be helpful for you to listen to, tune out. Ritualized eating means that you have to eat your food in a certain way or a certain order, or sometimes people have to cut it up any sort of thing that's like a rigid routine or kind of like ceremony around it that people become distressed about if they're not able to complete it. That's part of disordered eating. So that again is a step beyond just dieting to where we're starting to have some behaviors around food are different than people who have a healthy relationship with food. With binge eating and emotional eating with ritualized eating patterns, sometimes people will create kind of like a ceremony around binging. Like they'll plan out what they're going to do. They'll plan out kind of like a menu almost, or they'll set up like this elaborate spread of the food that they want to eat, and they'll prepare it or eat it in a certain order. And again, this is something that's really upsetting to the person doing it, them problems. So with disordered eating, we see behaviors with food that are problematic or upsetting for the person who's doing them, but they're not occurring at a level that what we psychologists would say is criteria. So if you're concerned about your eating, remember you can always contact NEDA, the National Eating Disorders Association, and you can find them at nationaleatingdisorders.org. They have a 1-800 number you can call, or an online free screening that can answer your questions and, if needed, connect you with an eating disorder professional like me. I think that you can benefit from therapy if you're stuck in the dieting mentality, or even if you feel like you have a healthy, kind relationship with food, but you want to continue to deepen your understanding of your relationship with food, or just maintain what you have. But therapy is especially helpful if you're dealing with disordered eating, or our final category along the spectrum, which is eating disorders. At that point, therapy is necessary. So disordered eating and eating disorders, I think at that point, you've got to seek out therapy. With disordered eating and eating disorders, you are much to negatively affect your health and to feel increasingly obsessed with foods. So therapy is necessary at that point. And just a reminder, early treatment for eating disorders is best, so don't put it off. All right, our final category on our relationships with food spectrum. So the final category is eating disorders. So I picture this as being all the way on the other end of the spectrum, completely opposite from a healthy relationship with food. Disorders include anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, and eating disorder not otherwise specified, also called EDNOS. EDNOS means that there are significant symptoms of the eating disorder fit neatly into other categories of anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating. So I'm not going to go over the diagnostic criteria here because I think that will only be triggering or anxiety producing or boring for some of you. So one of the things about eating disorders is that, which pushes them beyond the severity of disordered eating, is that they take over your thoughts. We're going to talk all about the eating disorder thoughts, kind of like we did on episodes 5 and 6 about recovering your perspective and all or none thinking. In eating disorders, that spot on the spectrum, the thoughts are most severe. Eating disorder thoughts take over most of your day, most days when you're at this level. Severe than the disordered eating or dieting thoughts. Though I'm sure you know, if you've ever been on a diet, and you probably have been, that your thoughts become obsessive and harmful quite quickly. But with eating disorders, it's a step beyond that. And at this point on the spectrum, the eating disorder point on the spectrum, is that you begin to organize your life around it, kind of like other addictions. You plan around when you will eat so you can avoid eating in front of others, or you plan binge. Your life starts to become about doing the eating disorder behaviors, and you begin to lose sight of who you are. You spend so much time doing eating disorder behaviors or thinking about doing eating disorder behaviors, time thinking about other things like your values or your interests, your relationships, or your spirituality. It takes over all of your mental space. Eating disorders are the most extreme form of an unhealthy relationship. They are the polar opposite of a healthy relationship with food. They are not based on loving kindness. Eating disorders do not care about making sure you're nourished. They take up all of your mental space, whereas healthy relationships with food require minimal thought about food. They certainly don't have fearful planning, measuring, counting, weighing. So all of that makes them very different. So healthy relationships with food based out of a place of loving kindness, wanting to support your body and all of the amazing functions it does for you every single day without fail. Eating disorders completely on the other end of the continuum. When you have an eating disorder, your eating disorder does not care if you are nourished or not. It cares about your weight, or it cares about you never feeling your feelings. And it cares about keeping itself going. So, complete opposites there. Additionally, when you have a healthy relationship with food, listening to your body is key. You can feel what your body needs for food. Sometimes your body is craving a salad and it's telling you, I really need some fresh veggies in me. And that is the attuned choice to make. And that when you make that match, that's success. That's all you've got to do. And other times burger, because it wants to feel really satisfied. Maybe it wants to eat that many calories, and that's fine. And when you eat that food, when your body's asking for it, that's a match too, and that's successful too. And in a healthy relationship with food, there isn't this judgment about the salad than the burger. And there's certainly not judgment about you being a better person if you choose the salad or being a lesser person if you choose to eat a burger. There just isn't judgment like that. Compare that to the eating disorder frame of mind, completely on the other. What the eating disorder does is it dictates you going by its rules. Listening to your body is basically non-existent at that point. And the eating disorder has to do that to you because it's going to cause you to override your biological cue, forces you to ignore hunger and to ignore your fullness. Because if you're listening to hunger and fullness, it makes it really difficult for you to do any sort of eating disorder behaviors. They're at odds with each other. Additionally, your eating disorder, rigid rules, lots of judgment about all different kinds of foods, when you can eat those foods, how often you're allowed to eat certain foods, how much, in what way, and maybe it even does some stuff where it ritualizes things. We can only eat this food in this way with this fork or whatever. Relationship with food, you're not worrying about that. You're able to be much more present and just enjoy food. Healthy relationships with food have, I just feel like they're less emotionally charged. You know, food is food and it's one part of life. And yeah, it's pleasurable, but it's not the end all be all. Unlike in eating disorders where the eating disorder itself will make your food choices seem like it is the end of the world, that there is so much pressure that every single meal and every single choice really does matter. And that's a bunch of nonsense caused by your eating disorder. So it can So again, if we review our spectrum here, on one end, we have a healthy relationship with food. If we go up a notch, we start to see the diet mentality. One step up from that is just not quite full eating disorder, but disordered eating, some of the patterns of the eating disorder. And then finally, on the other end of the continuum, on the other end of the spectrum, there's eating disorders that warrant a diagnosis and that definitely require treatment. So again, please contact Nita at nationaleatingdisorders.org, or you can call your local treatment center, and they'll just answer questions for you if you're curious about your relationship with food, or you have questions or concerns about that. So we're coming up on the end of a helpful way for you to think about your relationship with food, and that they exist on the spectrum, and that no matter where you are, there's always room for more peace and more kindness toward yourself. So if you did notice that side of the spectrum caught up in some things that don't feel good, you can definitely do some work with therapists or dietitians and get yourself moved more toward that healthy relationship with food, where you can nourish and enjoy your experience. All right, until next time, friends. In the meantime, please keep in touch and feel free to email the podcast at eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com. Thanks for joining me for another episode. Let's keep in touch, and you need about the podcast at eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com, including full podcast episodes and links to all of our social media sites. You can join our Facebook group for the podcast by searching Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast on Facebook. This is a closed group for listeners of the podcast looking to connect, share resources, and get involved in a pro-recovery community. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or YouTube. Please leave us a review and let us know how we're doing. Talk to you next time on the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast. This podcast is produced by me, Dr. Ch.